We are going to be talking about human trafficking and exploitation today, but before we start to talk about that, I'm going to give you a quick overview of what Safe Harbor is in Chautauqua County. We are a state/county funded program to address trafficking at the county level. Sometimes when I say that, I get some funny looks, like why would there be money to address human trafficking here in Chautauqua County? How many of us have heard of human trafficking? All of us, okay. What have we heard and where have we heard about it? I'd really love this to be a conversation today. I think that you guys probably might surprise your teachers with the amount of information you'll have, and probably even me. I always learn from my students, so I'd like it to be a conversation too. So who can tell me where they've heard about human trafficking and what you know about it? No one? You all raised your hands. Movies. What movie? Somebody said movies. What about the movie Taken? Some nods, yeah. Usually in every group I hear, oh, I know what that is. I saw that movie Taken. That girl got kidnapped. They got her hooked on drugs, and then they sold her for sex, right? Do you think that that's what human trafficking looks like in Chautauqua County? There's parts of that might be true, right? And we're going to unpack it a little bit, but that's not the full story. So we are addressing it in the ways that it is really happening in 3 different ways. Through prevention, and our prevention work is conversations with students kindergarten through 12th grade. We're talking to kindergartners and first graders and second graders because last year, another part of our program is doing casework, so working on cases of trafficking in our county. At the end of the year, I looked at the kids that had come across my desk, and we figured out that the average age was 14.7 for the time that they were coming to my desk. Before that, we had looked at the data for all of the kids that I had talked to in the county. We talked to about 1,000 kids last year, and the average age for that was 14. And we had thought that we did a good job. We talked to a lot of kids where we were preventing this from happening to kids. And then when you look at those numbers, and they're the same, we couldn't really call it prevention, right? Those were kids who had already experienced it, and probably their trafficking had started before they came across my desk. So we said, how are we going to address this with younger kids, so we can truly call it prevention? So we've found a program to talk to kindergarten through 6th graders, about how to be safe, spot red flags and warning signs of unsafe situations, and how to ask for help when they need it. So we're not talking to kindergartners specifically about trafficking, but just how to enhance their safety. And then when we get to your age level, we are talking about trafficking and the realities of it here in our county. So we're doing that prevention work. We're doing the identification and response piece, which I said is the case work that we're doing. Tracking cases. This is Wendy. We already talked about you. The casework and connection with services who can help address that in the kids that we see in our county. So that's kind of an overview of what we do at Safe Harbor. Before we get into, we're going to have a few activities today. We're going to have a video that we're going to watch. But before we get into that, just wanted to give a super basic definition of what human trafficking is. Taking advantage of someone for labor or sex in exchange for something of value. The person being taken advantage of is forced, lied to, or blackmailed, and or is under 18. It says labor or sex here. When we're talking about the cases that Safe Harbor has had in Chautauqua County, we're talking about sex trafficking. That doesn't mean that I don't think labor trafficking and conversations about that aren't very, very important, or that it's not happening here. We just haven't identified any cases in people under 21 in Chautauqua County right now. That could change super quickly. I feel like every time I say things like that to a group of people, my next few case calls are about what I just talked about we haven't seen yet. So that could change at any time. But really what we're talking about today is going to be sex trafficking and the commercial sexual exploitation of kids. The first thing that we're going to do, and the setup here is a little bit funny for what we're going to try to do, but we're going to talk about things that you guys find valuable, things that people in high school, even a little bit younger, think back to when you were 12, that might be hard now, but things that you thought were important or valuable to you then. And what I mean when I'm asking about the things that we find valuable, I don't want you to think about like your family or your friends, like tangible items or things like that that you think are important to you. Food and clothing, pretty important, right? We know that those are things that kids are, people are participating in sex acts to obtain when they don't have other means to obtain them. We call that survival sex most of the time. So those three things I saw on a few of them. What else did we see on a few of them? Electronics.
Yeah, I found electronics, gaming systems.
Does that sound surprising? When we no, it's really that those things are really that important to people your age, right? What else? We see shoes. Shoes came up on a whole bunch of them. I don't mean just like shoes to cover our feet so we can get to and from school and get through the day. Our contact at the FBI always tells me, Chautauqua County is a weird little place. And I'm like, yeah, you tell me every time we talk. But she said that our kids really, really like sneakers. Like to have like the newest pair of Jordans or something like that. And there's a lot of kids who are willing to do a lot to obtain those sneakers that they wouldn't be able to get in other ways. So food, clothing, shelter, shoes, things like jewelry I see, pets.
That was one that was common among
I see pets. What about things like money, right? That one seems kind of obvious. I don't think that a lot of us wrote it down because that's valuable, right? What about drugs? People your age, you're not answering for yourself. Nobody's gonna look around. People your age find drugs valuable? Yeah, and we're going to talk a little bit in a little while about how addiction can play into trafficking a little more in substances. I saw drugs, alcohol, tobacco up here. Vacations was one over there that I didn't see anywhere else. And if somebody can give us the opportunity to go somewhere that we've always wanted to go or do something different than we're used to doing, that can be really exciting and enticing to get somebody to do something that they wouldn't otherwise do. I see things like makeup. Anything else over here? And then I saw one over here that I thought was really good, tattoos and piercings. If we really desire a tattoo or a piercing and there's somebody who's willing to give us that without our parents' permission, and we can't get in another way at our age, that can be an exciting thing for some people. And we'll talk a little bit more about tattoos a little bit later today and how those often can be, I'm giving you a hint for later, a red flag or a warning sign that somebody's experiencing trafficking. And we'll unpack what it means to be forced, lied to, or blackmailed in a little while also. All right. We are going to start to think about who traffickers are. We'll talk about who victims are in a little while, but we're going to start to think about who the people doing the trafficking are. The word that you're going to hear me say a lot today in place of trafficker is a pimp. But pimps are sex traffickers who abuse and manipulate their victims. They target teens because they're easy to trick and very trusting. I always, when I'm talking to a group of teens, I don't like how this PowerPoint works, and that's because I don't think that you're all super easy to trick, right? Like, It's easier for traffickers to take advantage of young people because of lack of experience. You just haven't experienced as many things as people who are older than you. Does that make sense? I don't want to say like, oh, you're easy to trick. That's not at all what I mean. It's just age. The more life experience, the more you might be more difficult to trick you. We're talking about an estimated 100,000 children exploited into prostitution each year. And this is another one that I'm not thrilled about the language, because when we're talking about sex in exchange for anything of value in a person under 18, they're considered a victim of a crime. Most of the time, there is that force, lies, and blackmail that we talk to involved in that to get them to do that. But to me, when we say the word prostitute or prostitution, it kind of implies a little bit of choice, and what we're talking about is victimization. Ages 12 to 14, it's estimated somewhere in there, is the age of first exploitation, and that kind of goes back to what I told you guys about with 14.7 being our average victim age in Chautauqua County. All right. Raise your hand if you've been to any of the following places in the past week. A mall, grocery store, coffee shop, or on social media. All right, keep your hand up if you've been on social media today. Most of us, I see like 2 people in the whole crowd without their hand up for social media today. All right. Do you think that you, right now, before we talk about these, would be able to identify somebody who is trying to take advantage of you or exploit you? And when I say exploit, we're talking about taking advantage of someone. Think you'd be able to recognize those signs? Are you raising your hand because you're a yes, or you have a question? You believe so? Okay. Thanks for your contribution. All right. We're going to talk a little bit more about what those look like in a second, but we're going to talk about how we can maybe start to identify some of those signs and who traffickers really are. Some signs that somebody might be a pimp or a trafficker are that they're making you promises that sound too good to be true. They suggest that they know an easy way to make money. They might buy expensive gifts and like to flash their money. Is very vague about his or her profession, and might pose as a significantly older or controlling romantic partner. This says boyfriend, but it's important to note that this should just be romantic partner, because we do know that not all pimps or traffickers are male. All right, can you spot a pimp? I'm going to look at some, and then I want us to talk about some of the red flags and warning signs, the things that people noticed in Brianna and Lacey in the process. And then we're going to talk about gender stereotypes, and I think that's going to get us right to the end of our time together. Is there anything that anybody thought was really surprising about the video before we start to talk about the other stuff we wanted to cover?
That 13 girl went to that party or whatever.
That.
Like, she was like going in the 8th grade, she's 13.
Oh, so you were surprised?
Honestly, I don't think she had any business in going into that party, and like, why weren't her parents like aware of this party?
Sure, and that kind of goes back to like, it's normal for adolescents to want to take risks. Maybe she was a little young to start to engage in those activities, but maybe she's not. I think that we hear a lot of times that there are 13-year-olds or 8th graders who are making those decisions, and that's kind of why it's important for us to talk about those risky behaviors and the potential consequences for those choices too. That makes sense? All right. Can anybody think, was there other surprising things that anybody noticed? All right.
I think it's strange that these strip clubs have, I mean, it would
that was a 13-year-old? Yeah. Yeah, you would think so. And we haven't seen any cases in Chautauqua County of like minors like that young at a strip club. I'm sure that there's probably been some underage people who have participated in stripping at a club. But we do know that the trafficker that we talked about from Jamestown, he was often operating like an underground strip club at his house where people would come and watch his victims strip at his house. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it wasn't like a formal club like we saw here, but people were still using stripping as a way.
I was really surprised that, like, when the Lacey girl was skipping school and stuff, that, like, her parents didn't know, because, I mean, I get the bus thing, but I'm really surprised that the school didn't, like, call them after a while.
Because they were like aware of her absences and stuff. Like, parents were unaware of, like.
Yep. One thing that we talk about often is that kids who are particularly at risk have parents who aren't engaged, right? Whether they're seeking a connection for love or understanding those kind of things that they haven't got because of, like, from their parents, or they're just not involved for some other reason in their life. But yeah, I always think that's interesting too about the absences. And it is surprising, and something that we think about and talk about with school districts all the time about attendance policies. And I know that, like, I have a 9th grader, and we get like an automated call if she's not in school, like from the school district. I'm not sure how it is in Jamestown, and is that how it happens too? There are some school districts who don't do that. A nurse will call home or things like that, but there isn't a standardized policy across the board for all of the school districts in our county. So those absences, like, some schools won't report that to somebody until like 30 absences, and some school districts will do it way earlier than that or even farther than that. So those absences can be a really big red flag or warning sign that something is going on, and that's, the school should have picked up on that, definitely.
Or any changes in behavior, for that
Yep.
matter. It's really great to look out for your friends or your classmates, even if you don't have a connection with them, even if you do notice any bit of those changes in behaviors, should be brought to attention.
Yep. All right, let's go back to the force, fraud, and coercion piece. When at the beginning we talked about force, can you think of some examples that we might have seen in the video that you might consider force?
When they told the Lacey girl that, if she didn't do it, they were gonna go harm her family and stuff.
Sure, we're actually going to consider threats like that coercion. The coercion's the mental tactics that people use to take advantage of someone else. So threats to personal safety or to people that you love. And like Wendy said earlier, that's okay, you don't have to do it, I'll just go get your sister. If we're like responsible for them or we care about a younger person, that can be really terrifying, right? Like, sure, I'll do it so you don't hurt them. But that's that coercion piece. Yep.
Well, I'm assuming that Lacey probably got a ride to the strip club from her boyfriend or her husband.
Yeah.
And when she wanted to leave, he forced her to stay by not taking her. She didn't have another way out.
Sure. Yep. When we talk about force, we're talking about the physical ways that somebody do something. And sure, maybe typically when I say restraint, I think that we think about like somebody being tied up or not permitted to leave, but she wasn't permitted to leave, right? And there's probably like those mental tactics, like a little bit of coercion going on there, but she didn't have the ability to leave. So sure. Any other physical ways somebody might make somebody do something? Sure, absolutely. Can we just call that like physical assault? Is that fair? So physical assault, physical abuse, maybe like sexual assault or rape, right? We talked about restraint, kidnapping, and also the manipulation of addictive substances. So using drugs or other substances to make people either comply and participate in this stuff more willingly, or using those as a tactic to keep them there. Oftentimes we know that their trafficker might be their dealer, right? So if you don't, I'm not going to give you that heroin or the meth or whatever substance it is unless you do this for me. And because there's such a severe physical reaction to withdraw, we know that people are more likely to do it so they don't experience that. Does that make sense? Right, so talking about force, we've talked a little bit about coercion and threats, but another portion of coercion is blackmail. So an example that we can think about when we're thinking about blackmail is we start to talk to about 7th graders about this, and now even a little bit with our 6th graders, but conversations around things like we heard for Lacey, the video of her engaging in sex, but even things just like sending nude pictures or sexts, and that gets in the wrong hands of somebody, and they'll say, I'm going to leak this to everybody like they just did there. If you don't do what we're asking you to do, we'll make sure that that gets spread around. And that could be a really, really scary thing. And when we talk to even 7th graders, 6th and 7th graders about that, you see, oh no, I might have made a choice that could be really detrimental to my future. You know, it's pretty apparent in those classrooms that even kids that young have engaged in some of those behaviors. So just being aware of the potential that things like that even could have to turn into something more. But what about fraud? That's the one that we haven't touched on yet. What kind of lies might somebody tell? What was that? Their name? Like their identity, who they are? Where they live, sure.
They said that those people were his friends, and they were actually just like pimps.
Sure, yeah. People posing as friends or as somebody, maybe even, let's think back to like Nick or Lacey's boyfriend. I think that they were really romantically interested in them. No, right? They used that love and trust in a romantic relationship to take advantage of Lacey and Brianna.
Which,
The lie about, he said you make $85 waitressing and $850 if you do this.
Mm-hmm.
Even if a woman is like, you know what, this is kind of lucrative. I'm going to make some money here. Like, what's the real truth about how much money she gets?
Sure, so false promises or lies about wages, like how much they're truly going to make. We talk about living conditions and stuff too. Here, come live with me, work for me, and I'll make sure that your life is just better in general. Sure.
Like when you said something about fraud, and when Lacey went to Seattle, and Nick had that good house, maybe it couldn't have been his real house.
No, sure. That's kind of that false promises of like a certain lifestyle, right? Like she probably went there and saw that house and just like. Right. Yep. Those kind of things. You were going to say something.
I think the befriending and the boyfriending and the false lies and posing as someone as they're not, as if someone really cares about them. One of the major pieces that we're seeing quite frequently, too frequently right now, is the online piece. Okay? That's something that wasn't mentioned in the video, and it should be talked about today because, like all of you, pretty much the majority of you this morning was on social media this morning. Okay? Posing as someone as they're not. How many people in this room even think about to yourself, have you ever spoken to someone online that you've never officially met in person before? And that can be through social media. It can also be through Fortnite. It can also be through other games that you play, through technology. Think of how many people that you come across that you've never officially met in person, and how easy it would be to miss those red flags and warning signs of those people who are posing as a friend, wanting to make those connections with you, and filling that void of friendships that are valuable to you, or someone who shows love and affection towards you and really cares about you, and how easy we can miss some of those red flags.
Online stuff is super important to think about too when we talk about the people that we don't know online. Right now, on my caseload, I have an 8 and a 9-year-old who have experienced exploitation through Instagram. Accepted friend requests from somebody they didn't know, and there was blackmail around things like, hey, will you send me a nude picture of you? No, I won't send you a nude picture. Why would I do that? Well, that's okay. You already accepted my friend request, and I just took a screenshot of all of the pictures that you have of your face, and I'll just go ahead and copy and paste your picture, your face, onto Photoshop your picture onto other images of other kids that I have, and I'll just make sure that your parents see it. So even the simple act of having a public social media account, or even accepting friend requests from people that you don't know, and that you don't know piece is really important, because sometimes it can look like, oh, I have 120 mutual friends with them. Like, they have to go to my school, right? Or like, they know everybody that I know, you know, like, or I know who that is. I heard this one from my 9th grader not that long ago. I know who she is. Or I said, who's that person that you accepted on Instagram? Oh, her sister goes to my school. Okay, right? Like, her sister goes to my school. I know her. Like, I know her. She's safe. Like, I know her sister. Her sister and I are friends. Is that safe? No, not necessarily, right? It's like making it seem as if there's all of these connections that might not really be there. So that's a really important piece. And we, like I said, we know that I have an 8 and a 9-year-old on my list that started on social media.
And traffickers love it when youth don't set their social media to private.
Yep.
Because that's basically their job, is to sit in front of that computer all day and wait for someone to complain about their parents. You know, it could be anything. And they can just immediately pose as a friend who is going through the same situation. And so it will seem very subtle at first, but traffickers love it when you don't set your profiles to private. They also, that's another reason why our average age is so young, because our adolescents and youth typically, you know, are a little bit younger than you, or maybe even your age, don't typically think about those consequences. So they immediately act on that emotion or the vulnerability that they're going through at the time. And so we don't get to choose which vulnerability those traffickers are going to use.
Yep. One more online thing, and then we're going to wrap up our conversation with some red flags and warning signs and a what to do thing. Online, even if your account is set to private, it's important, like in your bio lines and stuff, to make sure that your information there isn't telling people how old you are or where you live. I know that I've seen a lot of social media accounts that will say, like, for example, with you guys, like JHS, and then, what do you guys graduate next year? 2020? No, 2019? 2020. Mixed group? Okay. So that on there, that's a lot of information, right? Like how old you are. You guys are a unique one too. I feel like the past couple school districts I've been to, we've talked about things like, okay, so you think you're safe. You don't put like Jamestown High School in there. You don't put that you're from Jamestown, but you put things like Red Raiders 2019. It's hard to figure out where, if you know that somebody's from New York, assuming that you're from New York, is it hard to figure out that you go to Jamestown if your mascot is the Red Raiders? No, we have other school districts in our county that are like the Marauders or the Thunderbirds. Not super common, right? So even just little things like that traffickers are aware of that we might never think about as being unsafe information to share. We wanted to quickly loop back to gender stereotypes. We've talked about kind of like who pimps are and how they can be both male and female. But it's important to acknowledge that just because we saw 2 examples of female victims in our video that we watched today, that this victimization is happening to boys too. Last year when I reported my data to New York State, I reported that 24% of the cases that I had come across were male victims. That's statistically higher than any other county who reported to New York State last year. That doesn't mean that I think that it's happening to boys more here. I think that somehow my partners who are doing the identification work did a better job than the other counties identifying them. But do you think that we realistically have an accurate picture of how frequently trafficking or other types of sex abuse are happening to boys?